is, why do we have Sabbath? Why do we, as people on this side of the cross, 2,000 years in time on this side of the cross, we don't celebrate Yom Kippur, we don't celebrate Tish B'Av, uh, uh, we don't celebrate Hanukkah, etc. Why? And we don't keep kosher. No one who's not Jewish keeps kosher. Why do we adhere to this one out of the 10 commandments? Why? And not just because it's the longest of the commandments in the Bible, not because it's central in the middle of the 10 commandments, but I guess the question is, why do we adhere to that? I'll go back to John Wesley for a moment. Many of you have probably heard, if you haven't heard of John Wesley, Google him. He's not alive anymore. But most of you probably will have heard of what's called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. It's a way of analyzing and thinking about materials, questions. If we're being invaded by aliens, what do we do? Well, you can try to analyze it through the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And an acronym for remembering what the quadrilateral was, and he never used this term, it's been applied to him after his passing, is the acronym REST, where R is for reason, E is for experience, S is for scripture, which really should go first, always go to scripture first, and T is tradition. What has been the tradition? And it's very interesting that you can apply this to all kinds of questions and dilemmas and ethical problems that come up, including, I think, COVID-19. If you don't have to be a pastor, but if you're just alive in the United States now, people are asking, what do we do about COVID? And how should the church respond? And I remember getting an email early on from somebody quoting C.S. Lewis about England being bombed by England and how they should go on and play darts and be in the pubs and live. That was great, but it wasn't very applicable, and it was a kind of a one-channel thinking on things. And if the quadrilateral was applied to Sabbath or to COVID, I think you get to better answers. I haven't systematically done this, but I hope that somebody listening to this does. If you really want to tear that apart, what do you do about COVID and rest and work and that sort of thing? I think you want to go through the Bible from one end to the other and look at the plagues there and how were they used, how were they what were the circumstances of them? Was God working or not working? He certainly was with David and the plagues. He certainly was with Sennacherib and the invasion and the plagues. Jesus and Matthew describe something that can only be like a plague where two people are working and one is taken and the other isn't. And two people are drawing water at a well, for instance, and one is affected and one is not. His heads up is, you never know when I'm coming, and none of us know, the number of our days. But you could apply that, and you could look at scripture, you could look at the experience. What has been the church's experience with plagues and things like that? There's actually quite a bit written throughout the last 2,000 years about hand washing and whether or not the church should wash its hands. And we have the experience actually of two much more recent people, Oliver Wendell Holmes and Aganza Semmelweis. There's actually a term called the Semmelweis reflex, or the Semmelweis condition, which was a widely used term 100 years ago and was bandied about in the church quite a bit. And that comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., and Aganza Semmelweis. They were both physicians. One was in Boston, one was at Vienna Women's Laying-In Hospital. And they both simultaneously, about 20 years before the Civil War, realized that puerperal fever, or it used to be called childbed fever, was greatly diminished if the people delivering the babies, whether that was a nurse midwife or a physician, wash their hands and their instruments between doing an autopsy and delivering a baby. And the death rate fell dramatically, multiple percentage points. I believe at Vienna Women's Hospital, it fell from in the 20% to 0.2% with this. And Holmes had a similar experience in the United States. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Semmelweis was jailed for this. Eventually, ironically, in 2 weeks' time in jail, it was a mental institution jail. He died of an infection, ironically. And in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was harassed, but he had a standing that was much greater than Semmelweis's. The Pennsylvania Medical Society revoked Holmes's license to practice medicine in Pennsylvania. Didn't affect him at all. He was really at the head of what was Harvard at the time, and he only practiced in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. And the question would be, why the rejection of this? Why? And the reason was that pastors and other physicians said that Semmelweis and Holmes were not following the Bible. After all, Jesus said we don't have to wash our hands. And so when you take up anything, whether it's COVID or Sabbath or circumstances, that each of you are dealing with and getting ethical questions on, look at scripture and the experience and tradition, and then using reason is always a great way to tackle things. So I'm gonna answer the question of why do we have Sabbath in a world where Paul writes things like one man esteems a particular day over another. In Romans 12, he's writing specifically about Sabbath and that you don't have to keep it. But he does say that everyone should have a firm conviction about it. And most people by default just go with what society thinks. And so if we look at scripture, Sabbath shows up right at the get-go. It's on the first page of the Bible. Now, the Bible obviously hasn't been communicated to us in the exact way that it was written. And one of the things that's been changed in scripture is the verses and the chapters. And I think most often, Stephen Langton is the one who's either credited or blamed with having put chapter and verse in the Bible. I think it was actually probably Hugo of St. Clair much earlier, in about the year 1200, who did this and applied it to the Vulgate. But I don't read Latin, and so I can't go back and look at his correctum, which is this treatise on correcting scripture. But either one of them tweaked the Bible in a way that I think is harmful to the Sabbath. In Genesis, each day God is creating a universe and out of nothing, and he's speaking it into existence. And each day he's making something that's more complicated than the day before. And then what begins in Genesis chapter 2 really should be Genesis 1, because I think the opening part of the Bible is a song. I think that for two reasons. One, Tim Keller thinks that, and number two, there's mention of the angels singing at the beginning of everything, and so I think this probably our opening of our Bible is a song, and that song ends with, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. And so God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." That's the end of the first creation story. And we see that already Sabbath has been invented, as it were, by God. He's made the Sabbath. It says he finishes his work on the seventh day. I think what he does is he makes this Sabbath, and he rests on this day. And God is holy, and God rests, and therefore rest is holy. It's in English it's called a syllogism, and in math it's called the transitive property. If God rests and God is holy, therefore rest must be holy. And this is the first time we hear the word holy, kadosh, set apart, in Scripture, and it's applied to Sabbath. And in the book of Genesis, at least, and in Exodus, it's not applied to anything else. It isn't how you behave versus, not stealing or being forgiving or that sort of thing. It's Sabbath. That's the first definition that we have of holy, is Sabbath.